no stranger to sponsored research near and dear to my heart, and has been involved in 6 funded projects totaling $825,000. Dr. McGloin is also a committed teacher and mentor. She received the Excellence in Teaching and Mentorship Award from her college in 2011, the Excellence in Teaching Award from her college in 2009, and was named the Merrill Presidential Scholar Mentor by the University of Maryland in 2010. Finally, Dr. McGloin is also an enthusiastic traveler and hiker. She is also the godmother to an adorable German short-haired pointer named Annie.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that gets the biggest reaction, all right. Yeah.
Finally, special thanks to the Beto Chair Committee members, Drs. Brittany Hayes, Nadav Marad, Jason Ingram, and Madeline Shortwood. And one last note, grad students to the Bates room for a discussion with Dr. McGloin after her presentation. Dr. McGloin, thank you very much for being here. They're all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's a Friday morning. It's slightly rainy outside, so I know it took a lot to get here, and I appreciate it. I also want to thank everyone for their hospitality. It's my first time in Texas. It's been a very good first visit. I appreciate it. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing over the past few years and how I'm thinking about it moving forward. And that work has led me to think about expanding, or perhaps thinking about the way that we expand our view of peer influence in criminology at large. And so I'm hopeful that I can maybe convince you on that front that we can do a little better in how we think about this theoretical perspective. I'd also like to acknowledge something out of the gate. I'm very aware of the fact that your department does some excellent work on the ground in the criminal justice system. And here I am coming in the doors talking about theory. I'm aware of that potential disjoint. When I was at Rutgers, I worked quite extensively with George Kelling, and he would often accuse me, I'd like to think affectionately, of having an affinity for the esoteric. So my hope is that today is not too theoretically esoteric, and I can convince you that there might be something of interest here. I recently finished up a piece with my colleague Kyle Thomas. He was a graduate student of mine at Maryland. He's now at UMSL, an assistant professor. We recently finished up a piece on peer influence for the annual review of criminology. And if you've read some of the pieces in that framework, what they try to do is they try to have you kind of take stock of where we are in something. Not surprisingly, when you're trying to take stock of peer influence in criminology, you spend the bulk of your attention on normative influence perspectives, on socialization practices. So differential association theory, social learning theory, symbolic interactionism. And these perspectives, the reason I have deviant in front of peer influence in parentheses is because that's what they assume. They assume that peer influence has a causal impact on delinquency because when you're exposed to deviant peers, that can affect your attitudes about the appropriateness of delinquency. It can affect the extent to which you're exposed to deviant models. It can affect your anticipated consequences for delinquent behavior. It can affect your own identity, how you think other people view you, how you view yourself, right? So the risk is rooted in the peers being deviant themselves. That's where the bulk of the literature is, the bulk of the theorizing, the bulk of the empirical work. But peer influence is not equivalent to normative influence. It's not held to those same boundaries. And I think our first acknowledgement of that is probably Osgood et al.'s extension of routine activity theory. So the argument that when people socialize with peers in unstructured and unsupervised settings, it naturally leads to more delinquency. This was a deviation from normative influence perspectives, both because it rooted the risk in the situation, but I actually think the larger deviation here is that what Osgood and colleagues said is you don't need the deviant in front of peer influence. You can have friends who in and of themselves are largely pro-social, but when you socialize with them in a particular way, that will inherently increase the likelihood of delinquency. So it was this expansion of how we think about peer influence. It said, we have to stop thinking about peer influence as being equivalent to or owned by socialization perspectives. We have to think about peer influence as bigger, as broader, and how theories can help us expand our conception of that. I had been doing work in normative influence. I had been doing some work on Osgood's perspective, and I was struck by this notion of we need to expand past these boundaries. And I pushed myself to think about how can we expand it? What can be the vehicle of further expansion beyond this? And it struck me that one way to get there might be to acknowledge what Mark Warr calls the other half of Companions in Crime. If you've read that book, if you haven't read it, it's a short read, it's a great read, I highly recommend it. His Companions in Crime text essentially says that yes, we should be focused on trying to understand group processes, socialization processes with deviant peers, but we cannot ignore the fact that the other half of the equation, the other half of the group in peer influence could be group crime, could be co-offending, when people offend together. And so it seemed to me that there might be gains from turning attention to group crime, moving beyond socialization, even moving beyond Osgood's perspective and saying, might this provide some kind of insight for us? Now, I want to be clear. This is not me discovering some new fact. This is not me discovering some novel thing. This is me simply pointing a finger at a fact that we've known for over 100 years. So here's a quote by Breckinridge and Abbott. And I raise that quote because I think it illustrates the point conceptually, but I also want to highlight the time, 1912, the endurance of this fact of group crime. We see it with Breckinridge and Abbott. We see it with Sean McKay's statistics at the juvenile Chicago court, that 80% of delinquents who showed up at the court had an accomplice, had at least one accomplice. We see it in Shaw's narratives, his delinquency narratives. We see it in William Foote White. We see it in Short and Strodbeck. We see it in Farrington's Cambridge data. We see it in official records. Those of you who work with official records, those of you who work in policing, those of you who work in corrections, sentencing, you know this, right? We've known it for more than 100 years, but we don't talk about it. We just kind of acknowledge that it was a trend, and we didn't pay theoretical attention to it. We didn't pay empirical attention to it. Well, why not? One possibility is that it just doesn't mean anything. It's incidental to the crime. It's just some characteristics. It's just some descriptive of what happened. Just because something is there doesn't mean that it's important for us to pay attention to it. I think this was the assumption for decades. 1912, that quote by Breckinridge and Abbott. And notice what they're saying. They're establishing it as like a known fact. The first piece that actually paid attention to group crime in earnest, that actually said, maybe we should study this, was by Al Reese in 1986. 1912, right? So I think there was a general embrace in the discipline that it just wasn't worth paying attention to. And Reese served as kind of a spark for paying attention to it. I think people thought, well, Reese is showing some interesting patterns. Maybe we should actually pay some kind of theoretical and empirical attention to it. And there's been a growth in the literature on group crime, but it's been kind of uneven. You know, some people have been paying attention to it, but it's still few scholars here and there. But despite that somewhat minimal attention, I would argue that there's been enough indications that we should pay attention to it. So there are indications that when people engage in group crime, when people are frequent co-offenders, they become more embedded in criminal lifestyles, criminal values, criminal networks, and that can facilitate them staying in a criminal lifestyle and impede desistance or sort of de-embedding from it, right? So it seemed to me that there was enough established to say that if you wanted to understand the decision to commit crime, if you wanted to understand peer influence, if you wanted to understand patterns of crime, you needed to understand why people actually engage in group crime. Unfortunately, there were only two theories that started to pay attention to this. One was by Bill McCarthy, and one was by Frank Weirman. And they're relatively recent, again. Remember, Reese didn't spark this until '86. So McCarthy's argument was from a rational choice perspective. He didn't understand why people would even decide to take on accomplices to co-offend, because from his point of view, it was risky, right? People can snitch on you, people can mess up. You know, you go to do a robbery with someone and the person freaks out and runs away and now it's ruined, or the person shoots the person when all you wanted to do was just take the guy's money. Someone can turn on you. There's just too many risks going on. Someone can also cheat you. What if you both decide to rob someone and then at the end of it, they take all the money and jet? So there's just too many risks. Why would you take on an offender, a co-offender? McCarthy argued that, look, there are times when offenders experience very adverse circumstances. Perhaps they desperately need money or they desperately need some kind of good. And so in those situations, they're willing to take on offenders, all right? So it's a conditional decision, but you only do it when you're in dire straits. Weirman argued that you take on co-offenders because sometimes the social exchange you get from them is valuable. So you get material goods from them, you might get immaterial goods, you gain something through the exchange. And when that exchange makes sense, you take on offenders. When it doesn't, you don't. What's interesting about these two perspectives is if you think about it, What they're doing is they're saying, people decide to offend first. And then once they're sort of a willing offender, then they think about whether or not they're going to take on accomplices. So assuming they've said offending is worthwhile, now will I actually co-offend? The problem with thinking about group crime in this way is it misses an essential attribute of group crime, one that I think resonates with the idea of peer influence. And Moore highlights this in his Companions in Crime. One of the most interesting things about group crime, of people engaging in crime together, is it can tempt people who would otherwise not do it on their own. So the idea is you can have people who, if left to their own devices alone, would not engage in an offense. But the minute they're in the group, all of a sudden that becomes a behavioral option, when it wouldn't have been before. So if you're interested in peer influence, you can't ignore that fact. That is sort of the essential kind of peer influence. You can change what you think is reasonable because of what other people are doing. So if we're going to take a step back and say, well, can group crime be a vehicle whereby we can get more insight on peer influence that expands us past socialization, expands us past just pure situational perspectives, we have to allow for that element, that attribute. We have to have a theory that can account for that. If we miss that, we're missing the boat, right? And so I started to think. I kind of sat back and said, okay, if we're going to think about pursuing group crime as a potentially interesting empirical endeavor, one that might provide us insight, we need to start asking ourselves, what is it? What is this phenomenon under study? You know, we've known about it for 100 years, but who's actually taken a step back and said, what is this thing that we're actually paying attention to? And in that process of thinking, and this is what I would recommend to most grad students, just go read, right? Because odds are someone's talked about something while you're thinking about it, and you may actually find treading in that. I came across this quote by Matsueda, who said, if we acknowledge the fact that the bulk of crime is group crime, and we kind of look at what that looks like, we realize that it fits in what we would call collective behavior. Now, collective behavior is a wide swath of kinds of behavior. So it would include things like voting patterns, movement, migration, diffusion or adoption of innovation. It's a whole host of behaviors, many of which are pro-social, right? So it may seem odd to think about it in those terms, but when you actually think about the process of kind of spontaneous behavior, people deciding to engage, sometimes in ways that doesn't make sense compared to their internally held values, it starts to make sense. It starts to fit. And so I thought, well, if Matsueda's right, and if group crime, maybe even crime in general, can be thought about as collective behavior, that opens up an opportunity. It opens up an opportunity to do what Osgood says is steal from our friends. We're an interdisciplinary science, right? We pull from multiple disciplines. That gives us the benefit of recognizing that sometimes there are ideas or approaches in allied disciplines that we can benefit from. We do this all the time. We do this, we pull from behavioral economics, we pull from sociology, we pull from government and politics, we pull from sort of psychology. List your discipline of favor, right? We steal from them all the time. It's natural. We can't stop doing that because we have allied interests, and so there may be a development of ideas in one discipline that we're missing out on in a way that is kind of stagnating our intellectual growth. And on this front, I was also reminded of, have you guys read or were you there for Bob Bersick's presidential address? Okay, read this piece. It's in Criminology. They publish the presidential addresses. It's called Dead Sea Scrolls. Something else is in there. Read it. It's short, but it's really interesting and really insightful. You would think that it would be about social disorganization. It's not. What he's essentially arguing is that in criminology, we have what he calls a newness fetish. We're interested in novelty. We think that's the shiny object. That's what we pay attention to. He said, but rarely is it actually new. Rarely is it actually novel. We think it's new, but someone else came up with the idea in another discipline. And maybe we think it's new because we're not well read. Maybe we think it's new because we sort of have a tendency towards hubris. Whatever it is, don't think that what you're sort of wrestling with is new, and don't reinvent the wheel. Take advantage of the interdisciplinary focus. And so I thought, well, if we think about collective behavior as being a good framework for group crime and for peer influence, is there a perspective out there on collective behavior that could pay dividends, that could actually allow us to expand our thinking? If there is a perspective, it has to be one that can account for the dynamics of the decision to engage in group crime. It has to be one that can accommodate what we know about group crime. And perhaps most importantly, as you can tell because I went all out and italicized this particular bullet, it has to be one that actually promotes research and theorizing, right? It has to be one that arguably serves as a heuristic. If all it's doing is describing, great, that is esoteric. If it's describing and helping to motivate new questions, new research, new theorizing, then it's useful. So can it serve as a heuristic? So I dove into collective behavior theorizing, and I came across Granovetter's threshold model. Same Granovetter as the strength of weak ties. Far from an intellectual one-trick pony, very, very smart, right? So Granovetter also stole from someone else. Granovetter liked Schelling's theory on residential segregation. So Schelling is an economist, won the Nobel Prize, and he talked about residential segregation as a choice that people make based upon, so their decision to stay in a neighborhood or leave a neighborhood depends upon how many people of their same race have left and or how many people of the other race have moved in, right? So when you look at racial patterns in neighborhoods, what Schelling said is it's an interdependent decision. I don't just make the decision based upon my own sort of what's inside my own values. I look at sort of how other people are moving. Granovetter thought this perspective was a nice counterpoint to how people were talking about collective behavior in the discipline at this time. Up until about 78, a lot of people, when they thought about collective behavior, especially antisocial collective behavior, deviant collective behavior, they talked about it as if you entered into this situation and you lost all rationality. Like somehow your frontal cortex just kind of disappeared and you had this collective consciousness, because people thought that's the only way you can explain the fact that people will act in ways that are entirely inconsistent with their value system when they're in a group. How do you explain that? Well, they must lose rational thinking. They must lose their capacity to actually weigh costs and benefits. They just give themselves up to some kind of mob mentality. And Granovetter did not like that perspective. He said, no. They don't lose rationality. They retain rationality, but it's a certain kind of rationality. So he said we got to move away from ideas of collective consciousness. We got to think about this from a threshold perspective. Taking Schelling's arguments, what Granovetter said is that the decision about whether or not a behavior is appropriate, whether or not a behavior has utility, it changes according to how many other people are engaging in the act. So let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a situation with 100 people. You're not going to engage in the behavior when 0 people are doing it, 1, 2, 3, but maybe once 20 people do it, 30 people do it, 40 people do it, all of a sudden your view of whether or not the behavior is appropriate or reasonable, it shifts, it changes. According to Granovetter, at that point at which the utility flips, changes, that point is a threshold. So if for you, it would be when 20 people do it, your threshold would be 0.2. For someone else, it would have to be 80% of people, your threshold would be 0.8. So what he's essentially arguing is when you're thinking about your decision making, it stays until all of a sudden enough people have engaged in the behavior to change your own thinking about it, and then it flips, right? So going back to Schelling's idea, I want to put it in the terms that Schelling spoke about. If enough white people move out, or enough black people move in the 50s or the 60s in suburban neighborhoods, that's going to affect your decision, right? You have a threshold. Up until that threshold's met, you're not moving. Once the threshold's met, you move. Now, according to Granovetter, thresholds can range from 0 to 1, and I have plus there too. 0 are people who, like no one else has to engage in the behavior, they're going to do it. Their motivation is so high, their propensity is so high, they're just going to engage in the act, right? And then you have that range that you would anticipate, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. 1 would be if everyone else does it, then I'll do it. The plus is because you're going to have some people who say, even if everyone else does it, I'm not doing it, right? So he allows for this fact that some people are not going to fall to temptation. But his argument is that people exist on a spectrum. And when you think about it in terms of that spectrum, you start to be able to understand the decision to engage in group crime. So I found the argument interesting. I found the argument curious, but that doesn't mean that it fits. It doesn't mean that it works. And so the question becomes, does it actually fit group crime? Granovetter used rioting as his primary example, so you would think that it would fit, but it was used as an illustration. There were no data to comment on it, so we can't necessarily take his word on it, all right? So I left this sort of thinking being convinced that it could fit for a few reasons. Number one, as you can probably tell from what we just talked about, it can absolutely deal with people who wouldn't engage in crime alone but would do with other people. That's the very core of the argument, right? It also allows for the idea that sometimes events can be planned, but oftentimes they can be fully spontaneous. You know, if you've read Gold's work on delinquency, he argues that it can oftentimes, criminal events are like a pickup game of basketball. They just kind of happen. People come together, they engage in the behavior, and then they go away. This allows for that fully. Group crime can also vary in terms of if you're likely to see it with certain crime types, how large of a group it is. This makes sense within this model. Also, the idea of differences in the tendency in group crime to instigate or to follow. There's research that shows that there's both individual and situational variation in whether or not people start group crime or they follow others into the enterprise. If you allow for the fact that thresholds can vary across people and across situations, it can fully account for that too. So it fits group crime fairly well, but remember my motivation in diving into this to begin with was whether or not it would help us expand peer influence more broadly. I think it can, and I'll dig into this a little bit more later on. But learning theories and situational theories are often posed as alternative views, oppositional views of peer influence. They're not. They can be talked about together, but we don't really have a framework that allows us to do that in a straightforward and easy way. And this might provide that. It also shines a light on those of you who are well-versed in learning theory, perhaps outside of crim and psychology where they talk about this a little bit more. There are situational elements to learning theory, discriminative stimuli, the idea that certain stimuli suggest that other reinforcement contingencies are in effect. This allows for that too. Also, I think very importantly, it shines a spotlight on the idea that rational choice perspectives may help us understand peer effects. Cullen argued that we have these silos, that we're bifurcated. We have criminology, and then we have criminal justice. Even if we have departments that have both, they sort of tend to operate in different spectrums, different domains. Well, unfortunately, we have that in criminology too. We have this sense that like people within certain theoretical traditions don't really talk to each other. If you're doing work on peer influence in socialization, whether it's differential association theory, social learning theory, you should be aware of what's going on in behavioral economics and in rational choice. The idea that there are experiments that demonstrate that when peers are present, people differentially weight risk and reward. So we need to expand our thinking and allow for rational decision models that can accommodate peer influence. They're not really talking to each other now. If we adopt this perspective, it may allow us to do that. So what are the first steps? Everything up until now that I've been talking to you about, it's all armchair philosophizing. It's all speculation. It's me sitting down and patting myself on the back because I think I'm clever in my thinking, right? You may not agree. But at some point, that's not going to be enough. At some point, I need to actually see if the data agree with me that there might be value here. So the first steps are actually asking empirical questions. The first one is perhaps the most obvious one. Do I actually see evidence of thresholds when it comes to offending decision making? Do I see it? Do I see the spectrum? Do I see people demonstrate conditional decision making? The second one is the story that I told you, the examples I gave you, this notion that the view of utility flips. It presumes that the decision changes, that the choice structuring properties change. That's the driving mechanism. I change what I think about the risks and the costs and the benefits of the situation based upon how many people are behaving. Well, are there data to comment on that? Does that actually happen? If the answer to these two things is no, I don't care how clever it is intellectually. We don't pursue it because the data don't comment on it. They don't sort of provide support. So, first question. Evidence of thresholds, do we see it? When we actually sit down to study this, this can be a bit challenging because we have to think about how do we study it. First, do any of you here do agent-based modeling or simulation studies? Good, okay. So simulation studies could arguably be very helpful here, but my impression is the discipline, the first time you're asking the question, is not going to be convinced by what is in essence hypothetical data, right? Also, we don't have enough information to feed input into these models. So that's one possibility, but I don't think now is the time. The second thing is, okay, well, let's just look at co-offending data. Let's look at information on group crime and see if we see evidence of thresholds. Curiously enough, when you have data on action versus non-action, it's very difficult to study thresholds because thresholds are behavioral intentions. If you look at patterns of behavior, imagine a situation, imagine you have CCTV footage of a prison yard, right? And you have 100 people in the prison yard, and a fight starts, and you can see people kind of jumping into the fight. And after about 20 people are fighting, no one else joins in. It kind of stops at 20 people. So you can say, all right, well, everyone who didn't join in, their threshold is higher than 0.2. Okay, but where is it? Is it 0.7? Is it 0.6? Is it 0.8? You have no idea. You're inferring that they have a threshold higher, but you don't know that. What about everyone who joined in? Well, that person joined in 5th. Yeah, but did they join in 5th, or did they start to join in and 2 other people beat them to the punch? Is there a lag between when you decide you're going to join versus when you actually start to join? So you're making inferences that are largely speculative when you're hoping to get into someone's mind, right? So those data could be helpful at some point, but right now they're far from ideal. When you recognize that you're interested in behavioral intentions, it opens up what's kind of been a tried and true method in rational choice studies, which is let's actually use hypothetical vignettes and get into behavioral intentions. Let's try to get there as much as we can. So that's what our first study is, and this was a study I did with a grad student who's now at Simon Fraser, Zach Rowan. So we surveyed close to 600 undergraduates, and I want to be clear, undergraduates are a convenient sample, but for us, we did not want an offender sample. Because think about it, we want to be able to capture that, those people who said, I wouldn't do it if I were alone, but I'll start to do it if other people are around. So you want to try to get a more general sample. But certainly it's convenient, but we think it's a fair starting point. What we did is we gave a hypothetical scenario about group crime on campus, and we basically said, how many people out of the 100 that are there would have to do it before you joined to try to tap into this threshold? And we gave them options from 0 all the way up to, look, even if everyone did it, I'm not doing it. And I just want to show you briefly what the scenario is that we gave them. The reason that some of the text here is a different color is because one of the things we experimentally manipulated were situational characteristics. So I'm not going to get into it, but we manipulated sort of in-group, out-group. We manipulated whether or not you were with your friends or not, and we manipulated what the crime type was. All right? So you can see, obviously it's with the University of Maryland. This was pre-Big Ten. This is when we're still in the ACC. That's why it says Duke. I'm being recorded, so I'm not going to say anything about that. All right, so what did we find? First, let me explain what the numbers here are. On the bottom is the threshold that was endorsed. So 0 means I do it on my own. I don't need anyone else to do it. 0.5 would be, well, once 50 people did it, once half the people did it, I'd do it, right? 1 means once everyone did it, I would join in. And 1+ means, look, even if everyone else did it, I'm not doing it. So perhaps not shockingly, in this sample, the majority of people said, I'm not doing it. You know, I'm not going to get involved in what is potentially some kind of riot. I'm not going to participate in that. But more than 40% said they would. And what I'd like to call your attention to is, if I had only asked, would you do this? Would you not? I'd get 1.72% of people who said I would do it, and everyone else would say I wouldn't do it. But the minute I opened it up to, well, what if other people do it first? What if a certain number of people do it first? Then would you do it? Then I start to get into close to 40% of the sample. All of a sudden it opens up where there are people who would say, yeah, I won't do it until this many people do it, then I will. So the willingness expands drastically. I would miss that if I only gave them 2 options. Also notice that every value is endorsed. Not huge percentages, but keep in mind, college sample. And I'm still seeing over 40% who said, yeah, if other people did it, I'd do it too. So I felt fairly confident that, okay, at least I'm seeing some evidence of these thresholds. Now the question is, do I see any evidence for the idea that what's underlying these thresholds is a change in decision-making properties? So what I wanted to look at is whether or not I would see changes in the anticipated sanction risks, informal costs, and social rewards based on how many people were engaged in the crime, right? So the fundamental underlying elements that inform decision-making. What's the risk that you think you're going to get caught? What about guilt, shame, right? Grasmick and Bersik's arguments. What about social rewards? Things like belonging, things like excitement. So internal, intrinsic rewards. Do those change? So this was a second study, another experiment. This is done with a colleague of mine, Kyle Thomas, who's now at UMSL. So we took advantage of having 2 university settings. which is great because I don't know if you know anything about these two universities, very different undergraduate populations, which helps us a little bit in terms of generalizability. Not past college students, but certainly within that, right? Maryland's very traditional in terms of, average age is probably 20, it kind of looks like a typical state university. UMSL, they tend to be much older. They tend to be much more ethnically diverse. And so it was nice to kind of get those two samples. Different baseline scenarios, because the sample at UMSL is older and a different sort of population, we didn't root it in a game again. There's not really the sports culture at UMSL. We talked about them being in a park and being in a concert, and they had an opportunity to steal things, right? And so what we did here is we experimentally manipulated in this scenario how many people took part. So that was randomly assigned across people. 0 people did something, 5 people, 25, 50, 75 before you joined. Do perceptions shift? What we saw is first, yes, as more people get involved in the incident, your personal belief about your risk of getting arrested goes down pretty dramatically as the number of people increase, right? As more people join in the event, your anticipated informal costs go down. You feel less responsible for what's happening. You also feel like you're not going to be as shamed by your family. I have an asterisk next to that because we saw that in St. Louis, but not at Maryland. It didn't pop. It was marginally significant, but not statistically significant. So you see that anticipated costs go down. We also saw that anticipated rewards go up. So you feel like you're more likely to find this exciting as more people take part. You're more likely to feel included, like you're part of something, as the number of people go up. So what's happening? There are incentives attached to more people being involved in crime. The things that would prevent you from doing it, the things that would hold you back, beliefs about sanction risk, beliefs about informal costs, those start to go down. And the things that might attract you, the things that might pull you to the behavior, social rewards, those go up. So this may help us understand why are there thresholds? Because as more people get involved in a criminal incident, your perception of the likely outcome of engaging in that behavior shifts. So the reason the decision is interdependent with people might be because your anticipated outcomes are interdependent based upon the behavior of people. So those are the data that I have now. Where am I going from here? Sort of what's my current thinking? I'm thinking in 2 planes. The first is a plane of expansion. What I mean by that is, again, at the start of my talk, I said one of the motivating factors for me diving into group crime was thinking about peer influence in a broader way. And so I want to push myself a bit to think about whether or not a threshold perspective actually allows us to move past this idea of certain theoretical silos that own some part of peer influence, and instead have an overarching framework that can accommodate these different perspectives to have a more realistic sense. And I'll get into that next, and I'm very much kind of thinking that through. The second thing is that I want to take advantage of this heuristic to better understand the interdependent decision-making itself. There's still more data that I need. There's still more investigations that have to happen to be convinced that this decision is in fact interdependent and to get more treading on what's going on here. So let me just take each one of these briefly. So, organizational brainstorming about what might this tell us or give us in terms of better understanding peer influence. I want you to think about someone going through a criminal incident in these 3 steps, all right? The first is when someone enters into a situation, they bring with them their value system. They bring with them their experiences. They bring with them their expectations, right? I think we can allow for that. So someone's importing themselves into a situation. In that situation, that means that they're bringing in their normative influence, right? They're bringing in the values that they have accrued from peers. They're bringing in their general expectations about what is appropriate behavior. They're bringing in their sense of identity about themselves. They're bringing in the sense of what they anticipate other people expect of them, right? So as they enter into that situation, they're bringing their life experience, which speaks to peer influence, with them. Once they're in the situation, there are situational elements that are also relevant to peers, relevant to group processes. Those might be things like, are your friends present? Are they exerting pressure? This will also shift things a little bit in terms of your decision making. But notice what it does is it says once you enter into the situation, there are group processes that are part of that situation that are now relevant here too. So at that stage, we can allow for different views of peer influence. And then finally, the situational decision, do you actually behave? Is your threshold met? That depends upon whether or not others act. Are other people in the situation? Do they engage in the behavior? How many? Is your threshold triggered? Just what we talked about before. So that's another way that we see peers being influential. And then once you make that decision, the outcome of that decision, sort of what happens consequent to doing it, that feeds back and affects what you import into the next situation, right? How did your friends react? Is this the first time that you did this kind of behavior? How does that change your propensity? How does that change your value system? So there's learning going on there as well. Obviously, this is very preliminary, and I'm not quite sure if what I'm doing here is helpful in terms of clarifying things, or if it's forcing things into a framework that doesn't quite fit. I haven't decided if I think it's sort of like jamming a square into a hole, or if instead it actually might allow us to have a framework that for right now we have, well, learning theories here, and Osgood's theories here, and other perspectives about, peer pressure here. And so everyone's talking about different kinds of peer influence, but we have no overarching framework. We shouldn't have theories saying, I'm only going to do work in this theory, but I study peer influence. I only do work in this theory, but I study peer influence. Peer influence has to be the overarching framework within which we think about how theories can provide insight. And so maybe a threshold model, if it doesn't allow us the kind of framework to do it, at least it highlights the need and the possibility of doing it. The second step that I'm thinking about right now is digging a little bit more into the decision itself. The reason I have that first sub-bullet in a different color is not a mistake. I'm having it stand out because that's a line from an email I got from Dan Nagin after a paper on this threshold stuff came out. He said, interesting, but why don't we see bigger groups? Why don't we see, given what you're finding, why isn't it a regular occurrence to see large riots, to see huge amounts of violent behavior with large groups? Why is it that most group crime tends to have a few people? If there's incentives as more and more people do it, why don't we see huge groups? Why don't we see huge mobs? And I had two reactions. The first one was, well, maybe when the opportunity for large group crime is there, we tend to put more guardians there, right? Think about sporting events. Think about where we have a lot of people gathered together. A lot of times we anticipate that this may be an option, and so we try to put guardians and engage in situational crime prevention that allows us to reduce the likelihood. That might be it. But it could also be that there's something about very large groups that change the game. So I went back and read some more. And this shouldn't be surprising from Granovetter's perspective because he talked about what he argued was an opt-out threshold. Everything I've talked about up until this point was the opt-in, right? Why will I engage in the behavior? According to Granovetter, everyone also has an opt-out, assuming that at some point they would have opted in, right? Oh, I'm doing well, okay. I'm going to join in now because enough people are joined in. And then all of a sudden, as more and more people join, some of us may go, this is no longer a good idea. I'm not doing it anymore. And they opt out. So his argument is that this utility, it can't just flip once, it can also flip again. Maybe the reason we don't see super large groups is because that's an illustration of an opt-out threshold. People just all of a sudden say, this is not a good idea anymore. Well, if that's true, if that's the case, to have an opt-out threshold, it means one of two things must be happening. The first is all the incentives I just talked to you guys about, like the risks, sanctions, costs, rewards, maybe they sort of become incentives at a certain point, and then they flip back. Like there's a U relationship, it's not linear. So maybe it's the fact that the incentives change after a number of people get involved in a different way. We didn't really find evidence of this when we looked in our data. Now, granted, we only went up to 75 people, right? So maybe it has to get bigger than that. But 75 is a lot of people, right? If you think about it. I mean, when we're talking their small groups, we're talking through 2, 3, 4 size. 75 is a lot. So why are we not observing it there? We did observe a flattening, like the gains started to kind of diminish some, which would make sense. Like how much sort of less cost or how much reward you're going to get from 50 versus 75 people is probably not as dramatic as from 0 to 5 or from 5 to 10. So we see some flattening, but we don't see this kind of inversion. So it said to me, well, maybe it's not about the incentives changing. Maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's something that structures our choices that we haven't talked about yet, something that becomes a disincentive as more people get involved in crime. And so, grad students, lesson again, when you are puzzled by something, you go and you read and you think, right? Which I know is not a luxury that most of us have, but sometimes it's necessary to try to figure out where the next steps are. What struck me as curious is that in some literature, we talk about harm to victim, but we don't integrate it into our models of decision making. So where have we talked about it? You guys know Sykes and Matza, right? Techniques of neutralization. What's one of the main techniques? Thank you. It was not a rhetorical question. I appreciate that, Alicia. So it's denial of, not just denial of victim, but denial of injury, denial of harm, right? If you think about it, if part of the way that you rationalize behavior, that you allow for behavior, is you pretend that there was no harm to the victim, that suggests that if you acknowledged harm, it would impede you from engaging in the act. It suggests that harm matters, because why would you go to the trouble of trying to excuse it if it didn't matter, right? And Sykes and Matza were noticing that in their delinquents, that they went to the trouble of doing that. Those of you who do work in situational crime prevention, right, regardless of outcome, one of the things that they will often talk about is highlighting harm, making people remember that there is harm. They've seen this with environmental crime, remind people of the ecological damage that could happen. They've done this with people with a variety of outcomes, saying, listen, you know, there's consequences to this act. Someone's going to be hurt by this act. And there's some research to suggest that actually changes outcomes. So harm may matter there. Jeff Buffard did an interesting study in 2002. It was on rational choice. Rather than asking subjects outright, you know, what do you think is your sanction risk? What do you think are the costs? He said, I'm going to let them nominate their own outcomes. I'm going to let them say what they think are the consequences of these acts. And he did vignettes for drunk driving, and he did vignettes for sexual assault. In both settings, people self-nominated harm to victim. It was something that they were thinking about when they were actually making a decision. Now, Jeff in most cases coded it as kind of moral wrongness with some other things, but to me that struck out. They talk about harm to victim. Yet when I looked at empirical studies, has anyone actually integrated this into decision making? Has anyone looked at this? The closest I found was Bill McCarthy doing stuff on danger. He looked at harm to self. So he looked at the idea that when people decide to commit crime, they think about what's the likelihood that they're going to get hurt, right? From rational choice perspective, that makes sense because it's a very kind of self-centered decision, right? The idea is, why am I going to think about other people? I'm going to think about myself. But for those of you who have any background in psych, you know that altruistic behavior is generally not altruistic, right? In many cases, helping behavior or stopping something from happening or not participating in something, it's not because you're so empathetic. It's because we get physiologically uncomfortable when we see people who are hurt, when we think about harm to other people. It makes us uncomfortable. It is a psychic aversive stimulus, right? We don't like it. So people have argued that altruistic behavior is not really because you care for the person, you're trying to do good. It's because you're trying to shut down that feeling. You're trying to make that go away. So if we think about it in those terms, then harm to victim, perceived harm to victim, is this internal cost attached to behavior. Makes us uncomfortable. Well, doesn't it make sense that harm to victim goes up as more people participate in the crime? More people fight. More people damage property. More people steal from a store, right? Arguably, we don't know, arguably harm goes up. So it could be that the reason we sort of missed what's happening in terms of why don't we see super large groups is because we haven't actually measured harm to victim in studies of when people decide to commit crime. And could harm go up as the more people involved actually take part? So that's something that I'm wrestling with right now. It's going to be work with Kyle Thomas again. We think that we definitely want to look at both violent and property crime, because it may be that harm to victim is really only salient, only resonates with violent behavior. You know, maybe that property crime, to get to that point, you really have to have so many people involved, or not. People may think about the financial cost to people. They may worry about that, right? You know, if you're in a tailgating area, right, and someone says, let's knock down their stuff. Knocking over a table and there's some food on the ground, versus 20, 30 people start tearing apart something, you may actually start to think, oh God, these people are really going to replace everything. That's going to cost them money. It's going to be a pain for them to clean up, or not. It could just be violence. So we want to look at both crime types. What our core interest here is in whether or not perceived harm matters for offending, and whether or not that is affected by the size of the group. So this is about the peer influence question that I talked about 2 slides ago. Is it a framework? Is it about expanding it? Can it accommodate different perspectives? This is about taking that threshold argument and digging deeper and asking, okay, how can we better understand that decision process in a way to provide additional insight on how it is that peers shape behavior within particular situations? So that is 45 minutes on the dot. All right, I think I'm good, yeah. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. If some of you had the unfortunate task of reading any of my work, I'm happy to answer any questions about anything else. Yeah?
I haven't had a chance to see this, but is there anything that you've done or that you're working on that would take a dichotomous approach so you can capture what you're gaining by adding a threshold? So you give a randomized vignettes, and some of them actually yes, no, engage, and some of them have the threshold model, and then you see what proportion of yes and no's then are absorbed by the range.
Yeah, I haven't done that explicitly, right? So you can probably tell from this, my assumption is that the people who said yes to a threshold would be absorbed into the no's. I wouldn't do it because in most cases, they'd be alone. But maybe not. Maybe some of those people who said 0.1 or 0.2 thought, okay, well, if I have the option of people doing it first, then I'll do that. But really, I probably would do it by myself. I haven't done that. The tricky thing here is that for those of you who've done vignette studies or any sort of experiments in those domains, it's really tempting to give people multiple vignettes so you can do within individual studies, because not only does that give you potentially some more rigor in the analysis, but allows you to jack up your sample size. The problem is that when you're only changing 1 or 2 things, you run the risk of the demand effect. And so the work I presented to you here on whether or not the group changed anticipated outcomes, we first did that with multiple vignettes per person to see if within people you change your perceptions. And rightly so, some reviewers were like, wait a second. The only thing that's really changing, because it's the experimental treatment, is the size of the group. People are going to know what you're asking them. So we had to chuck those data and collect all new data. So it's a really good point. I'd have to think about how to do that in a way that wouldn't court that demand effect again.
I think if I were going to do it for funsies, I would do it.
Oh, it's like, I was going to say Donahue, but I'm going to date myself, yeah.
I would really just think about having multiple different versions or different versions of the actual survey and distributing them randomly. So you're not taxing them with, I get what you're asking, you don't have the vignette. You get one shot at it. Some people are reading it one way, some people aren't, and hopefully you capture something.
Yeah, I mean, my inclination is that the majority of them will be absorbed into the no. But you'd have to, I mean, it's absolutely an empirical question. Hey, Melinda.
It's for the video. Jean, can you talk about the role of gender in the collective behavior framework, and also whether you did see gender differences in your empirical work?
Okay, so we can talk about it in 2 ways. Empirically, we haven't observed gender differences, notable gender differences, right? There's going to be differences across gender in terms of their overall tendency to view crime as attractive or unattractive, but in terms of the change, the effect of group on that, the relative change, we didn't see big differences there. So if we think about it as kind of an amplification issue, men are here, women are here, they're both kind of moving up, right? But my experience just anecdotally and kind of piloting surveys and talking to people and talking to students is I think gender matters quite a bit in terms of how they think through these things. I also think that as we start to get into this potential harm issue, I think it's going to even resonate more there in terms of this culture of care and culture of concern. So I think I may be dipping into areas where gender is going to matter a lot more. And so it's a really good point. It's something I probably need to pay attention to quite a bit. In the collective behavior literature more broadly, and Granovetter more broadly, he didn't really wrestle with individual differences. He wrestled with it in terms of ideological or different motivations for the behavior under focus, but not issues like gender, race, age, et cetera. But definitely harm to victim, I think, is going to resonate. Thank you.
I also had a question related to the harm to victim. Do you think any, other than the difference between violent and property offending, would characteristics of the victim themselves, what things do you think might?
So we're piloting now, and I think we're going to be piloting for a bit, because each time we pilot, we get more feedback from people. So the piloting initially was really about how long is this going to take, and what's happening is we're having to keep on shifting and changing things because of the feedback we're getting from people. This is where gender becomes important. Almost in every setting when I've piloted the instrument, it's been the women in the group who have said, well, who's the victim? You know, is the victim a guy? Is the victim a woman? Is the victim, who is this person? And in part, I think they're thinking, well, okay, am I going to get involved in this if it's someone who's bigger than me, if it's someone who could injure me? The odds of me being able to hurt someone who's double my size versus someone else who's around my size, is it someone who's my gender, someone who's not my gender? So it definitely, I think, factors in the characteristics of the person. And that becomes tough because there's a temptation to, well, let's vary that and see what happens. But as you start to expand and expand, as you've said, we have to think about it as a between persons test. All of a sudden you have so many conditions. Do you have enough power to actually get at this? So I think for the first foray into it, we may kind of go the easy way out and tell people someone of your same gender and size. But this is absolutely, especially with the violence, because here's the thing, the collective behavior, most of the stuff up until this point has been on rioting, stealing, damaging property. We haven't really looked at violence, and I think it's gonna affect things quite a bit.
Jean, I really was fascinated by your presentation. Thank you for
thanks.
giving such a well-articulated talk. I have two questions, and actually one of them sort of follows what Andrea was just saying. The characteristics of the victim. Granovetter's threshold hypothesis or approach, it seems to me that it could be applied to pro-social behavior as well, like bystander
100%.
intervention. And that has to do with those characteristics of the victim. So a lot of the research on whether or not someone's going to engage in bystander intervention
Right.
Has to do with, the risks that they see themselves facing, particularly if they're female. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Sam Houston has this, but there's been a growth in college campuses on trying to deal with sexual assault through bystanders. So I'm sorry if you guys are probably aware of that and probably involved in it. But I don't know the extent to which these interventions are taking into account the idea that how other people behave and I think it's crucial.
It's kind of like you said, we have this, we operate in a vacuum and we don't think about what other disciplines or what other people are thinking.
Everyone thinks they
So-
discovered something new. Yeah.
And so that's pretty big in the bystander literature. The other thing that I just, the entire time that you're talking that I cannot get my head to stop thinking about is the way in which this would be very useful to use hypothetical scenarios to look at sexual assault, particularly on college campuses and fraternity environments. There's stuff from, all the way back to the 80s that asks likelihood to rape. How likely are you to engage in these behaviors if you wouldn't get caught? But nothing that I've ever seen that talks about if, X number of people were to participate in this, what's your threshold? And so that's just like,
I think that would be interesting. So Ray Paternoster did some work on sexual assault using vignettes, right? But I agree with you. No one I've seen has sort of looked at that aspect. And I think what would be interesting, I think we'd have to do there, Granovetter was very clear on it's the behavior of other people. Did they do it first? But I think in sexual assault, it would be interesting to look at if they were there, like true bystanders, versus, they're engaging in the sexual assault as well. So I think there's a lot of open areas for investigation that's going to be meaningful. Take your time. Take your time.
I just had a quick question about when you talked about group size and disincentives. Could the role of having specialized offenders in that group mediate the concept of group size and disincentives? I'm thinking of like an Ocean's 11 style scenario. Weird example, but as you have more specialized offenders, are you less likely to say, well, things could go wrong? I actually have people that are more likely to get this job done. Does the risk go down?
Yeah, I think the situation that you're talking about might actually fit better with some of the things that Weirman was talking about. So in that situation, you might have someone who's decided to offend and then thinks about the social exchange. All right, do I trust this person? What will I gain from this situation? Is my risk lower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think from a threshold perspective, it's often portrayed in kind of this spontaneous situation. You're in a setting, do you actually do it, and then do you move on? So I don't know, it can absolutely accommodate for those kinds of situations, those more planned, you're aware of your network more, you know your sort of people more, but I don't know that specialization of the people who are actually engaged would play a role in this situational decision. And that might be a limitation of the threshold model. That may be something that it can't fully accommodate for. But I also think that in most co-offending incidents, they're not that planned out. They're not that thoughtful necessarily. But absolutely from a social exchange perspective, that would fit perfectly. There's not a line of people, so take your time. It's okay.
A real quick question. Can you speculate about the theoretical mechanisms that underlie variation in thresholds?
Okay, I can always speculate.
Okay.
So one thing I didn't talk about here is as part of that first inquiry into whether or not we saw evidence of the distribution of thresholds, we also investigated potential individual level predictors and potential situational predictors. So at the individual level, it will not surprise you to know that one of the big predictors of threshold is impulsivity. Right? So people who are more impulsive tend to have lower thresholds. People who are less impulsive tend to have higher thresholds. Now, it's not the case that people who are low, sort of have high impulsivity are like, only zeros, and people who have, low impulsivity are only I'll never do it, right? There's that spectrum, and that plays a role. It does influence thresholds. They're not equivalent, but it plays a role. Moral beliefs play a role. So kind of when I talked about the idea of what attitudes you're importing into a situation. So if you believe that something is wrong, your threshold's going to be much higher. It's going to be closer to 0.8, 0.91. If you believe that something is an acceptable behavior, or you believe ideologically that it's the right thing to do, your threshold's going to be lower. It's going to take fewer people to go first before you join in. There's also, now there could be many other things, right? In certain situations it could be gender. In certain situations it could be a host of individual level attributes, right? But there are also situational attributes that can matter. And one thing that we found that mattered was whether or not the group that you're in, are your friends versus strangers, right? So if you're there with your friends, your threshold is lower because maybe there's greater expectations on your part of social cohesion, of doing what your friends want you to do. Right? We also found some evidence that it varies by crime type. So what's actually happening here? So Granovetter allowed for the idea that there are individual level predictors that we bring into situations with us, things that affect our threshold from a starting point. And then in the situation itself, there can also be things that kind of change the setting, so to speak. So I think there's a host of things that can affect thresholds that you bring into the situation. And sometimes, and I think that makes sense with the literature, because the literature suggests that offending decisions vary by people, but are also malleable in the situation. People are not static in their beliefs, and settings can change them. And I think this allows for both.
Just a quick follow-up question. Actually, it's a completely different question.
Go ahead.
Do you think that there's anything that we can learn by studying collective behavior outside of the human species? Thinking really broadly. I'm assuming that there are other species that are social and...
My opinion is that research is good, end of sentence, right? So I think there's always things to be gained. I think it would be interesting to see if there is universality in certain behaviors and certain trends, and I would suspect that there probably is. But I think I'm just trying to say maybe we should look outside of CRIM to learn. I don't know that I'm willing to go out on that limb yet, but I suspect that we probably can learn from that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Question?
Yeah.
Could you talk about key turning points in your education and your graduate studies that you view in hindsight as being big deals for your development?
Sure. So the biggest turning point for me, it was before grad school. It was where I went to college. And the reason that was a huge turning point to me is because it taught me what I think is the most essential lesson for scholars to learn, which is the combination of confidence and humility. So have confidence in your intellectual abilities and sort of build that, but at the same time never forget that you can turn a corner and walk straight into someone who could crush you intellectually, right? And so that was a very good lesson to have for 4 years in a place that demanded that you work your butt off, right? That you can have the strongest of work ethics, and you should, but never lose sight of the fact that there are many people out there better than you, right? It's a good lesson to have when you go into graduate school because we sometimes get a bit full of ourselves. In graduate school, I think the lesson is listen to what you want to do and try to get as many experiences as you can. So I didn't know what I wanted to do when I knew I wanted to study that topic. I thought the last thing I wanted to do was be a professor, so you never know. And I thought, let me get as many experiences as I can in graduate school. Let me work with practitioners. Let me collect data on my own. Let me do secondary data analysis. Let me teach in a variety of settings. Let me do research with fellow students. Let me do research with faculty. Let me get as many experiences as I can, because from a practical perspective, since I don't know what I want to do when I get out, I better be prepared for a potential array of options. And two, this is how I'm going to learn what I want to do. So I think I would sort of think about that in graduate school. Be sure that you're getting the experiences you need to actually know and have enough data to make an appropriate decision. I don't know if this happens here, but I've seen graduate students who say, oh, I want to be a professor, but they've never taught a class. And that's risky. Like, what if you hate it? What if you're not good at it? You need to get some practice. Or people who say, I want to be at an R1, but, they haven't really gotten a feel for the publication process. And so do you know what you're getting into? So try to get the experiences that you need to really inform that decision. In terms of once you have a job, learn as much as you can from the people around you. I walked into Maryland, and I had, down the hall from me, Denise Gottfredson, John Love, Ray Paternoster, Sally Simpson, Peter Reuter. I had people who were at my level, Brian Johnson, who I don't think has he might have the record for the most criminologies ever, right? So you have these people around you, and it was very easy to walk into that environment and be scared. To have the second of, well, how can I do this? You can't, you're straight out of graduate school, right? So you're not going to be that. But what you can do is you can treat graduate school like a residency, if you were leaving medical school, the idea that your training's not done, right? So get as much as you can from those people. I had people read my papers. I asked them to read my papers. They were kind enough, right? Give me feedback. I watched them. I watched how they taught. I watched how they interacted with students. I watched how they wrote their papers. I watched how they decided where they were going to submit papers. So treat leaving graduate school as an opportunity for another several-year sort of spell of learning. You don't have to be explicit about it. You don't have to tell people that's what you're doing, but absolutely do it. And I think that connects back to this confidence and humility, right? You know that you can do the job, but my God, you'll do it better if you allow yourself to recognize that there are experts all around you. And how do you do that? How do you sort of take advantage of that expertise? So I think college framed me more than graduate school, but I think getting as much experience as you can, and when you walk into the door, always being willing to learn, always, and take advantage of the faculty around you, learn from them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.